You buy something, right? A t-shirt, maybe your coffee, a new phone. It shows up, you use it. Seems simple.
Yeah, on the surface.
But behind it, there's this huge, invisible network of people. The farmers, the miners, factory workers, the people driving the trucks.
Absolutely, the whole global value chain.
And, well, how they're treated.
Yeah.
That's often not simple at all, is it? And definitely not always transparent.
Not historically, no.
And I think as, consumers, investors, just people, we're getting more aware of this whole complexity. And the rules are starting to catch up.
That's right. Regulations are evolving.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into a really key piece of that, specifically in the European Union. We're focusing on ESRS S2. That's one of these new European sustainability reporting standards. And this one, S2, is all about workers in the value chain.
A very specific focus.
Exactly. And our source is the standard itself. The actual document laying out what companies under EU rules have to report.
Straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Yeah. And our mission really is to cut through all the, let's face it, dense regulatory language.
Can be quite technical.
Right. We want to understand what this standard actually asks companies to look at, why it's such a big deal, and what it's trying to achieve for all those workers out there, and, importantly, for the companies themselves.
Yeah, the link is critical.
Think of this as your essential guide to understanding this piece of sustainability reporting that really centers on people.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this standard.
Well, what's really striking, I think, is just how ambitious it is. The sheer breadth of it. It's not just asking about a company's own employees.
Right. You mentioned that's a different standard, S1.
Exactly. ESRS S2 makes companies look outwards. It wants them to enable anyone reading their sustainability report, investors, NGOs, to really get a handle on the material impacts on workers all the way through their value chain.
Actual and potential impacts.
Both. Positive and negative, identifying what those impacts really are.
Okay, so if I'm reading a company's report that follows S2, what should I be learning? What kind of picture should emerge?
You should get a clear view on a few core things.
Yeah.
First, those impacts. How is the company actually or potentially affecting workers in its value chain?
Okay.
Second, what's the company doing about it? The actions they're taking to prevent problems or fix them or maybe support positive changes. And crucially, is any of it actually working?
Right, the effectiveness piece.
Yeah. And third, and this loops back to the business side. What are the risks and opportunities for the company itself that stem from these worker impacts? And how are they managing those? And finally, they want to see the potential financial effects, short, medium, long term. So it really connects the dots between how workers are treated and the company's bottom line, or at least its financial outlook.
That financial link feels really significant. Now, you stress this isn't about the company's direct employees, so this term value chain worker, who exactly falls under that umbrella?
Yeah, this is a really important distinction they make. So ESRS S1 covers the own workforce, employees, agency workers directly controlled, that kind of thing. ESRS S2 covers value chain workers. Which means basically all other workers, upstream and downstream, who are or could be materially impacted by what the company does, its operations, its products, its services, even just its business relationships.
Okay, can you give some examples? It sounds potentially huge.
It is, and the standard gives some helpful pointers. Think about, say, the catering staff or the security guards who work on the company's premises but are actually employed by an outsourced company. They're value chain workers under S2.
Ah, okay. Even if they're physically there.
Right. Or workers in a supplier's factory, maybe thousands of miles away. Or staff working for a retailer who sells the company's products downstream.
Downstream too, right?
Yeah. Or even technicians who come on site sometimes to do maintenance but work for the equipment supplier. And then you get into the really deep parts of the chain. Think about workers extracting the raw minerals or harvesting the cotton that eventually becomes the company's product.
Yeah.
It's designed to be very comprehensive.
Wow. Okay. That really does cast a wide net. So what aspects of these workers' lives are companies supposed to be focusing on? What kind of impacts?
It drills down into core human and labor rights. The standard asks companies to explain how they manage impacts related to a few key areas.
Right.
First, working conditions. This is broad things like secure employment, reasonable working hours, getting an adequate wage, the ability for workers to engage in social dialogue, freedom of association, so, unions, collective bargaining.
The fundamentals.
Exactly. Plus work-life balance, and of course, health and safety, a huge one.
Okay, what else?
Then there's equal treatment and opportunities. This covers gender equality, equal pay for equal work, access to training and skills development, making sure persons with disabilities are included, tackling violence and harassment, and promoting diversity generally.
Right.
And finally, other work-related rights. This is where you find the absolute prohibitions, child labor, forced labor, but also things like adequate housing or water and sanitation if the company is involved in providing those, and respecting workers' privacy.
So it's basically the whole spectrum of internationally recognized labor rights, but applied across this huge extended chain.
That's the idea, respecting these fundamental rights throughout the value chain.
Okay, but how does, let's say, a problem with working hours for a farm worker way upstream, how does that become a risk or maybe an opportunity for the big company sitting in Europe?
Now that's where it gets really interesting, and where the standard tries to make that business case explicit. It argues negative impacts are business risks.
How so?
Well, imagine forced labor is found deep in your supply chain. Suddenly, there's a risk your goods could be seized at the border by customs authorities in, say, the US or EU. That's a major operational disruption.
Okay, direct hit.
Or think about reputation. Bad press about worker exploitation, even by a supplier's supplier, can seriously damage a brand. Consumers might walk away, investors get nervous.
Mm-hmm.
The standard points out other things too, like heavy reliance on poorly supported contract workers during a pandemic.
Right.
That showed massive business continuity risks. Or constant price pressure on suppliers. That can force them to subcontract, maybe to places you don't even know about, making the chain less transparent and potentially riskier.
Less visibility, more risk.
Exactly. And even things like exploiting low-paid workers. Maybe it saves costs short-term, but the standard frames it as a reputational and business opportunity risk long-term. Plus, skills shortages in your value chain are a direct threat.
Yeah. Okay, so lots of potential downsides. What about the flip side, the opportunities?
Right. It's not all negative. Respecting rights, running support programs that can build a more stable, reliable supply chain. Suppliers with good labor relations are less likely to have strikes or disruptions.
Makes sense.
It can also be a market differentiator, appealing to consumers who care about ethical sourcing. And thinking long-term, like ensuring coffee farmers earn enough to stay in business, that's managing an impact, sure, but it's also securing your future supply of coffee beans. That's a clear opportunity.
So under this standard, treating workers well isn't just portrayed as, nice to have CSR. It's framed as core to business risk management and future strategy.
Precisely. It connects social performance directly to business resilience and potential growth.
Okay, so if that's the why, let's get into the what. What do companies actually have to tell us? What are the disclosure requirements?
They structured around a few key areas, basically asking companies to explain their approach. It follows a common pattern: strategy, impact, risk, opportunity management, and then metrics and targets.
Got it. Strategy first.
Yeah. First, strategy. This links back to some core ESRS requirements. Companies need to show how the interests, the views, the rights of these value chain workers, who they need to see as key stakeholders, how that actually feeds into their overall business strategy and model.
So not just an add-on, but integrated.
That's the goal. They need to explain how impacts on workers, good or bad, actually connect to or maybe even stem from their business model. And then, crucially, how understanding that connection might lead them to adapt their strategy or model.
Okay. What kind of specifics are needed there?
They need to describe the types of value chain workers who might be affected. Are they on-site but outsourced? Upstream, downstream, in joint ventures? And critically, they have to explicitly identify and describe any groups of vulnerable workers.
Vulnerable workers. What does the standard mean by that?
It gives examples. Think about young workers who might be at risk physically or mentally, women workers facing discrimination, migrant workers who can be exploited through recruitment fees or lack of regulation, workers handling dangerous substances or equipment, or even low-paid workers on precarious, 0-hours contracts. The company needs to show they've thought about who might be most at risk in their specific value chain.
So it requires some real analysis, not just generic statements.
Definitely. They also need to flag if there are specific regions or commodities known for high risks of, say, child labor or forced labor, and whether the negative impacts they see are systemic problems in a whole sector or country, or more related to specific incidents.
And positive impacts, too.
Yes. They should also briefly describe activities creating positive impacts, maybe improve purchasing practices, capacity building with suppliers, job creation, helping workers transition in a just transition context, and then summarize the main risks and opportunities that arise from all these impacts and dependencies.
Okay, so strategy is about showing they understand the connections between their business and worker impacts, including identifying the hotspots.
Exactly. It's about showing this is part of their core thinking.
Right, so after strategy, what's next? The how.
Pretty much. That's the big section on impact, risk, and opportunity management. This is where they detail their approach. It starts with policies, S2-1.
Okay, what policies?
Companies have to describe their policies for managing these material impacts, risks, and opportunities relating to value chain workers. The key here isn't just saying, we have a policy, but explaining how comprehensive it is. Does it cover identification, assessment, management, and remediation?
And what should be in those policies?
They should align with international human rights standards, especially the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs.
Right, the global benchmark.
Yeah. The policies need to reflect a commitment to respect human rights, engage with affected people, and provide remedy when things go wrong. And critically, they must state explicitly if their policies address the big issues: human trafficking, forced labor, compulsory labor, and child labor.
They have to call those out specifically.
Yes, and they need to say if they have a supplier code of conduct, and if that code covers key worker issues like safety, fair wages, those severe labor rights abuses aligned with ILO core conventions.
So comprehensive policies linked to global standards.
Hmm.
What else in management?
Next is engagement, S22. This is about how companies actually talk with workers or their representatives, or maybe credible proxies like local NGOs or unions who understand the situation on the ground.
So finding out what workers themselves think.
Exactly. The goal is to see if and how worker perspectives are actually being heard and considered. Companies need to describe who they engage with, how often, who inside the company is responsible. Are there formal agreements with global unions? How do they even know if their engagement is effective?
And does it mention vulnerable workers again here?
Yes, it specifically calls for attention to engaging potentially vulnerable groups. And if a company doesn't have a general process for engaging value chain workers, they have to state that and maybe explain if they plan to implement one.
This really does seem key. Are they actually talking to the people affected?
It's fundamental to the whole due diligence idea, yeah. Then, okay, what happens when impacts do occur? That leads to remediation and channels, S23.
Fixing problems and ways to report them.
Right. Companies need to disclose their approach to providing remedy or cooperating in providing it, putting things right. And they need to describe the channels available for workers to raise concerns or grievances.
What kind of channels?
Could be company-run hotlines, could be supporting third-party mechanisms, could be through unions, dialogue processes, even findings from audits. They need to explain how they support or require these channels to exist in their value chain workplaces.
And just having a channel isn't enough, I guess.
No way. The standard pushes further. It asks if companies check whether workers actually know about these channels and, crucially, whether they trust them. Are their policies protecting workers from retaliation if they speak up?
Trust and non-retaliation. Vital.
Absolutely. The standard even points to international principles for assessing effectiveness. Are the channels accessible, predictable, fair? Do they lead to outcomes compatible with human rights? Again, if a company doesn't have these channels or processes, they need to say so.
Okay, policies, engagement, remedy channels. What's the last part of management?
It's taking action and effectiveness, S24. This sounds straightforward, but it's about the concrete steps. What actions are they taking or planning to take to prevent or mitigate negative impacts? What are they doing to provide or enable remedy? Are there additional positive impact initiatives?
And the effectiveness question again.
Always, they need to track and assess the effectiveness of all these actions. How do they identify what action is needed? Are they changing their own purchasing practices? Are they doing capacity building with suppliers? Collaborating with others? Using their leverage?
Using leverage, that sounds important.
It is, and a really critical point here, paragraph 35, is about avoiding causing or contributing to harm through their own practices. Like, does intense pressure on price or delivery times from the company itself undermine efforts to improve conditions down the chain? They need to report on how they manage that tension.
That's getting quite searching.
It is. They also need to report on severe human rights issues or incidents identified in their value chain, and explain how they track effectiveness audits, impact assessments, worker feedback, grievance data, ratings, benchmarks.
So it sounds like they really need to show their homework, not just list activities, but prove they're actually making a difference.
Exactly. Effectiveness reporting needs to link actions to outcomes for workers. So not just We did training, but we did training, and subsequent worker surveys and safety data show conditions improved. That's the level of detail ideally sought.
Linking actions to results.
Yes, and maybe linking positive initiatives to worker needs, perhaps even to things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, like SDG 8 on decent work, showing resources allocated, how it's integrated into risk management. It's about demonstrating a systematic approach.
Right. Policies, engagement, remedy, action, and proving it works. That's a lot under management. What's the final piece?
The final piece is metrics and targets, S25. Companies need to disclose time-bound, outcome-oriented targets.
Goals for improvement.
Exactly. Targets for reducing negative impacts, for advancing positive impacts, and for managing those related risks and opportunities we talked about.
And it's just about setting a number.
No, the standard again asks about the process. How were these targets set? Were workers or their reps involved? How is performance tracked against the target? What are the lessons learned?
So involving workers in setting the goals too.
Potentially, yes. The guidance suggests disclosing that, and targets should ideally focus on intended outcomes for workers. They can link risk opportunity targets to impact targets like a target for suppliers to pay a living wage, improves worker outcomes, and reduces supply chain risk. They can set short, medium, and long-term targets. It's about showing direction and measuring progress.
Phew. Okay. That is a really detailed framework for looking at workers way beyond a company's direct payroll. So stepping back, what does this all mean? What's the big picture here?
I mean, it signifies a real shift. Sustainability reporting, at least under ESRS, is getting much more granular and, frankly, much more focused on the actual human beings involved in these complex global value chains.
It's moving beyond just environmental metrics.
Massively. ESRS S2 gives this very specific, quite demanding structure for companies to really dig deep, understand their impact on people, often people they don't directly employ or even know, and then report transparently on how they're managing those connections, the risks involved, and any opportunities.
And for you, the listener, why does this matter?
Well, whether you're looking at a company as an investor trying to gauge long-term risk, or as a consumer wondering about the ethics behind a product, or just someone trying to make sense of how global business works, this standard provides a framework, a way to potentially see if companies are genuinely grappling with the human dimension of their value chain.
A lens to see who's taking it seriously.
Potentially, yes. It allows you to ask more informed questions, to look for that evidence of policies, engagement, action, and crucially, effectiveness. It's a tool to try and understand the human stories that sit behind the products and services we use every day.
It's definitely ambitious. I mean, this standard asks companies to understand and report on issues that can be incredibly complex, sometimes deliberately hidden deep within these sprawling value chains.
Yeah, the challenge is immense.
It asks about tracking effectiveness, about worker trust in grievance channels. So here's something to think about. Just how feasible is it for a huge global company to truly know and then accurately report on the lived reality of every single worker involved in bringing, say, a smartphone or a chocolate bar to you?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
And what happens when this regulatory push for transparency crashes into the often murky, multi-layered, and frankly, quite opaque reality of these incredibly complex global supply networks? Where does that leave us?